Greetings EPQers and welcome to a quick video on introductions of that which takes place before the research review. So not too complicated, but there are certain things that do need to be in them. So let's have a look. So these are the things that should be in your introduction, and your introduction should be about 750 words. Now with the word counts, don't get lost in them. So if it's 800 words of pure gold, that's brilliant. If it's 600 words and it does everything it needs to do, that's fantastic. If it's 1,000 words of rubbish, it's awful. And if it's 500 words of rubbish, it's awful. So, 750 words is a great guide, but don't start kind of trying to trim off 3 or 4 words here and there just to hit the word count, if what you're writing is gold, as I'm sure it will be. So let's look at the structure of these introductions. So we start off with a hook, something to draw the audience or the reader or the examiner rather in, to get them interested in your 20,000 word document. Next thing you need to do is put the question in bold type. So it's crystal clear what the question is. You'd be amazed at how many people don't do that. After that, the question needs to be put in context, and we'll come on to that in a little bit more time. Yes. Okay. Next, define and limit. So what are the limitations of your question? What does it really mean? Then you'll outline the research review, then an outline of the discussion, then an overall answer to the question. And overall, all of these things, it could be 2 or 3 paragraphs of about 750 words in total. So let's have a look at some of these things in a little bit more detail. So having a look at the hook, how is it going to start off? Start with an engaging quote, statistic, fact, or little scene to draw the reader in. And the EPQ will dictate what that is. If you're doing a literary EPQ, you could do a very brief kind of highlight of one of the most moving scenes. If you're doing a science EPQ, it could be a really significant quote or statistic or something along those lines. So obviously you are the ones who know your EPQ and your subject area. What do you think is going to really draw in someone who doesn't know so much about your question? The other thing you need to do with this hook is flow into the question. Don't just leave it as an isolated quote at the start. So for example, in 2019, 9 out of 10 students reported mental health issues while studying A-levels. This staggering statistic led me to investigate the question, bold, should A-levels be reformed? So you've got your statistic and you've blended it into the question, and it's not just this isolated bit at the beginning. So other hooks, as we've talked about, 80% of the world's data is stored in English. This led me to realize or led me to investigate the linguistic nature of computer programming, whatever you like. So again, nice little statistic, that's a true statistic apparently. Something that just goes bam, draws people in and go, oh, okay, I want to read about this. The other thing you can do, as I said before, is just the little scenes. If you're doing a more classical EPQ, start with a story. Over 2,000 years ago, Alexander the Great stared across the Indus River, realizing his great empire had reached its limits. So, setting the scene, creating a bit of tension before you then go on and explore, the greatness of Alexander's empire or something along those lines. So dragging someone in with, that quote, statistic, scene, fact, something of interest. That's the hook. That's how the EPQ should start, or could start. It's not compulsory, but it's a good idea. Another thing to really think about, though, if you can't think of anything now, come back and do it later. You may find that actually, you finished your research review and suddenly you've picked up this great statistic or something that you thought was really interesting and go, oh, actually, I'll use that at the beginning of my EPQ. So what do you need to do next? You need to put the question in bold in type. Now, what you could also do is put spaces around it so that it's crystal clear what that question is. You must put it in bold type, so it's very, very obvious what it is. Very tiny thing, but makes a difference, and it's a requirement. So make sure it's done. Once you've done that, what you need to do now is put the question in context. So I think in the workbook it says, what is the wider political context? But again, that may not be entirely appropriate to your EPQ. But really what we're looking at here is, how does your question and your area of study fit into a bigger picture, a bigger, more important picture? So for example here, imagine you're doing an EPQ on, should we build a base on the moon, or should we go to Mars, or should we invest 10% of our GDP in space programs, or something along those lines. What you want to do is put space programs in a sort of wider political context. Governments have spent 90 billion on space programs in the last 10 years in a world where some people live on $10 a day. No, that's far too much. $10 a month or something, I think it was. Space programs are seemingly the ultimate luxury. So you're not just focusing on space programs, you're putting it in a broader context. It doesn't have to be cost. It could be a cultural context, a political context, a financial context, a scientific context. It's where does your field of interest fit in the world, if you like. So put it in context. Now, the next thing you need to do is define and limit. And again, it slightly depends on the question, but it may be important to really get to grips with what keywords in the question mean, especially if they've got a meaning that we think that we understand. I'm sure there are all sorts of social and medical terms. Kind of an example might be, anxiety, for example. Someone describes himself as being anxious, but that's not the same thing as clinical anxiety. So if there's a key word that needs to be explored or explained or made clear, then do that here so that the rest of the introduction makes sense. Don't randomly start defining or exploring words that don't need it. Some questions are crystal clear. Could we reach Mars, or should we go to Mars? All of those words are good, simple words. We know what they mean. Don't bother breaking down. Mars here means the planet, not the delicious but slightly overly sugary chocolate bar. You don't need to do that. But if you're doing something maybe a bit more sciencey or more medically, if you were doing something like should CRISPR be illegal? People might think, what the hell's CRISPR? And then you have to go, CRISPR being, the gene editing tool or system or process, discovered by blah, 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 blah. So just be a bit selective about what keywords in the question you define. The other thing you need to explore at this point is limitations, and your EPQ is limited by time, by word count to a degree, by all sorts of things. And it is perfectly acceptable for you to explain what those limitations are. And again, depending on the EPQ, it will be different types of limitations. So if you're exploring, say, the impact of Shakespeare on, game design, computer game design, or computer game narratives or something along those lines, you can say, due to the large number of Shakespearean texts, or for whatever valid reason, I'm going to focus on these 4 texts and explore how they have influence on game design. I shan't be looking at the following texts. I shan't be looking at these other texts because they're less appropriate, because they're harder to read, because they haven't been translated well. And it can be anything. What are the limitations? If you're looking at is a king successful, or something along those lines? What are going to be the most important measures of success? Well, finance, military victories, political reforms, and religious stability. However, you're not going to look at his contribution to art, because whilst it's important for a narrow field, it would make the EPQ too big, too cumbersome, and you believe that those 4 other areas are more important and have better quality research available for you to explore and discuss. You know, it's those kind of things, and this is not a negative. This is not something that loses you marks if you say, well, I don't have time to discuss this, or there aren't enough good sources on this, or you know, due to time constraints, I have to limit myself to 4 of these theories or examples rather than the full 6. This is a good thing. This is showing that you have got a good understanding of the area, but also an understanding of the limitations of a project. So this is a really good thing to do. And again, don't just put random limitations in there that are not actually that valid. You know, if you're doing an EPQ on Shakespeare, you don't say, I will not be discussing the works of I don't know, oh, who wrote Game of Thrones? Oh, oh, geez. No, you know what I mean. So don't say, well, I'm not going to be discussing, you know, oh Jesus, who was his name? You know, oh, anyway, don't just put in all sorts of random limitations that you wouldn't be expected to discuss anyway, because people think, well, yeah, obviously you're not going to discuss, you know, this and that and so on and so forth. So make sure they're valid limitations. Make sure there's a reason why you're explaining them, why you're putting them forward. So moving on to the next part of the introduction. What you need to do now is outline the areas that you're going to look at in your research review. And you should have an idea of the 4 or 5 areas that you're going to explore in the research review. And again, that is so dependent on the type of EPQ that you have asked. I mean, I can obviously chuck out a few examples, but you know, it completely varies. Now, what you need to do with those areas that you're just briefly outlining, I think it's really helpful to explain why you need to understand them in order to access the discussion. So, and you could even be explicit, you know, in order to understand, in order to answer my question, should we go to Mars? We need to have an understanding of how the American space program developed from its origins in 1945, because this leads into the area of discussion, should blah, 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 blah. So be clear and be explicit as to why these 4 or 5 areas are important to understand the discussion. And again, it's just a very brief outline. So what are the areas, why are they important, how do they link to the discussion? You know, really, you know, 150 words. So 5 things, what's that? Why do I ask myself questions that I don't know the answer to? You know, really not many words per 4 or 5 little area, if you see what I mean. So, makes sense to have that almost as a standalone paragraph. You could combine it with the next section, which is the outline of your discussion. So what are the 5 areas of your discussion? And your discussion is much more of the debate. So this is where the, you know, the to and fro, the fighting, if you like, is going to take place. And again, it just completely depends on your EPQ as to why you've identified those areas for discussion. But one thing I would do here is explain why you've chosen those 4 or 5 areas for discussion. Why are they appropriate frameworks for analysis? So, for example, if you're doing a comparison of you know, kings, you're comparing the success of William the Conqueror and Harold Godwinson. You're going to look at things like their military strategy, their economy, their political skills. You're going to look at them because those are you know, fundamental measures of success that dictate whether a kingdom stands or falls, or these are things that were considered by authors of the time to be the sort of fundamental characteristics by which you judge a king. You know, you're not going to judge them on, you know, beard length and clothing choice. You know, slightly patronising example, but you know what I mean. Make sure you're explaining why those 4 or 5 areas of discussion are sensible places to have a debate. What you should also try and do is try and explain why they work together. So you know, if you're judging, the effectiveness of a car or something, or an invention, or the significance of a literary text. Why is it important to look at the numbers that the book sold, the people who the book sold to, the number of times the book has been referenced in future works. Why do all of those things work together as a really good framework of analysis? Don't get lost in that, but I think showing why they work together is a really good thing to do in the introduction, because it makes you think about it, and it is one of those things in the mark scheme. You do have to show that your sections are linked. And one of the dangers of EPQ is that it becomes all about lots of little sections that are never truly linked together, and make sure you avoid that trap. Now, once you've, I think in that same paragraph, although I suppose it could be again a separate, nice, simple, clean sentence or two, write a final sentence that answers the question. Now, this obviously isn't your whole EPQ, and you haven't really gone into any of the details or facts, so it's just going to be an outline, but it helps the examiner, the reader, or whatever, know where you're going. And I think that's really useful from an examiner's perspective. Don't keep it as a surprise at the end. I think it gives you a bit of guidance as well. So, and it will be at this stage very simple. Should we go to Mars? Thus I believe we should. Thus, even though the cost is high, I believe that for the good of humanity, we should go to Mars. That's it. That's your answer. That's the big overall point, and then the EPQ unfolds from there. So, moving on, a couple of top tips. Remember to re-edit your introduction as your EPQ evolves. Sometimes the introduction will stay as a pretty sort of solid thing that doesn't change at all. Sometimes you'll find, you hand in the introduction, you think it's all great, you do the research review, and then you think, oh, actually, having done the research review, I think I'm going to change something in my discussion. I'm going to do a slightly different area, and maybe your opinion will change. You start off thinking, oh, well, finance is going to be the driving factor in this assessment, and actually it turns out to be, environment or something. So if that happens, make sure you go back and re-edit your introduction. And again, you really want to avoid things just being these almost separate segments. As always, read the exemplars. You've got 6 or 7 up there now, so just have a look through, compare and contrast, look at the ones that are good and similar-ish to what you're doing, but also just look at them all. Sometimes actually looking at something that is not vaguely similar to what you're doing can give you just a new idea, a new perspective, and they're all good. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the exemplar box. Other things. This is a bit personal to me. I know it says you can do it in the handbook, and if anyone who's not in my class is watching this, and your teacher says you can do it, then absolutely fine, no dramas. I don't really like the bullet points. I think just these nice prose paragraphs on the research review and prose fully written paragraphs on the discussion. I wouldn't use bullet points in the introduction. Other teachers may disagree, but another top tip to remember with EPQ is that your teacher marks your EPQ. Now, yes, they're sent off to the exam board to be double checked, and we all sit around and kind of talk about them, and it is a fair and sensible process, but by the nature of the game, if your teacher tells you to do something, whoever that may be, then do it. Okay, lovely. Well, that's introductions. Obviously, if there are any dramas or issues, then do send me a message. If not, I will catch up with you in the next class. Take care, guys.